Hey everyone, today I'm here to do a review of There by Tommy Orange. This is a debut novel and one of the most buzzed about books to come out so far this summer, so I wanted to make a review to join in the conversation about this book. This is going to be spoiler free, so no worries if you haven't gotten around to picking this one up yet. Though the plot in this book is fantastic, I'm not going to be focusing on that. Instead, I'm going to be talking about my three favorite elements of the book. The first one being the way that Tommy Orange uses narrative structure to present the complexity of contemporary Indigenous identity, the second element being his well-drawn and memorable characters, and the third element being the way that Tommy Orange comments on American history. So for some quick context, this is a book about a big powwow happening in Oakland, California. The first half of the book is largely introducing the characters that are planning on attending. It goes into their backstories and some of their reasons for wanting to go to this powwow. And then the later part of the book is everyone is meeting together at this powwow and some big events are unfolding. So this is largely about the modern day Indigenous experience in America. If you check out on the back flap, Tommy Orange himself is a registered member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma, and he himself also grew up in Oakland, California. So some of those aspects of his identity are reflected in a lot of his characters. Most of them are city dwellers with strong ties to Oakland, and quite a few of them do mention that they are Cheyenne. But the great thing about this book is that it uses at least 14 different narrative perspectives, so there is no one single representation about what it means to be Indigenous. Largely, this book focuses on the urban Indian experience, so these are characters who didn't grow up on reserves surrounded by other people in their community who share the same identity, but rather they have grown up a bit more isolated, growing up in a city where they feel like their identity is a bit more invisible. So it's a lot harder for them to understand who they are and where they've come from. For them, having an Indigenous identity isn't just about checking off a box and understanding who they are, but rather it's more of this kind of complex journey, and it's very individual, and we see that each of the characters in this book is at a very different place in their journey. There are some characters in here who know that they have Indigenous heritage, but because of adoption or absent family members, don't really know how to be Indigenous, nor do they feel comfortable claiming that part of their identity, even though it might be something that resonates deeply with them. On the other side of the spectrum, there are characters who have been connected and do feel very proud. There are characters who are dancing in the powwow, getting all dressed up in regalia, and proud to continue on their cultural legacy. There are also characters who are curious and are learning about powwows and fancy dancing through YouTube videos. So technology is definitely a big game changer in this book for how characters are going and seeking out information about who they are. What's cool about this book is that it really champions and celebrates all of these different ways of identifying as Indigenous, and a lot of these characters in this book compare themselves to other Native Americans and they feel like they're being judged or they feel like they're not Native enough in some ways, but I think Tommy Orange is really saying with this book, there's no one way to do it, and however you find ways to express your Indigenous personhood, that is good enough, and that is a triumph in the 21st century. So I think that that is a very cool message that this book explores. This message, of course, is only able to succeed because Tommy Orange employs such wonderful characters as the vehicle. So like I said, there are 14 different narrative perspectives, so you really get to go into the minds and hearts of a lot of characters in here, many of whom will just jump off the page. I will say that perhaps 14 narrators is a bit excessive, and there isn't a lot of stylistic diversity between the voices, so some of these voices do get lost and they don't appear as memorable as some of the other characters. But that being said, you are going to meet some excellent people if you read this book. Some of my favorites include Opal Viola Victoria Bearshield, who is just as awesome as her name suggests. She's someone who has come out of a difficult childhood and is now herself raising her sister's 3 grandchildren. And I also loved characters like Tony Loneman, who has fetal alcohol syndrome, or as he calls it, the drome, and he's someone who's tired of the way that people have judged him based on his appearance for his whole life, and he's starting to run with a pretty bad crowd of friends. And also Edwin Black, who is pretty much at rock bottom at the start of his chapter. He is extremely overweight, extremely constipated, unemployed, addicted to the internet, and then he decides to catfish his father so that he can have his first conversation with him via Facebook. So there are some really memorable characters in this book, and I loved how this book was structured so that you had generous access to each of these characters' backstories, so that by the time that they actually reach the powwow, you feel like you really know who they are as people and you're quite emotionally invested in what happens to them. The last element of this book that I'm going to discuss is the way that Tommy Orange incorporates US history into his narrative. When I watched an interview with the author, he mentioned that it's really important for him to provide context to his readers because he assumes that many of them, especially coming from a settler perspective, are not going to know the true history, and this history is really essential to understanding where his characters are coming from. For example, a lot of the characters in this text and Tommy Orange himself identify as Cheyenne. So he reminds readers about certain incidents that happened in the past that will help inform us of what it means to be Cheyenne. One of them in particular is the violent Sand Creek Massacre, where the US Army went in and killed a basically defenseless group of people. It was mostly elderly people, women, and children, and they were shown no mercy. So this particular event, I think, really demonstrates how cruel US history is and how brutal it is that Americans have been rewriting this history right from the start because no one wants to be the bad guy, right? Americans don't want to see themselves as people who killed and displaced hundreds of thousands of people just to take their land. They want to see themselves as friends who were sharing the land and making better use of it, and that's where the whole Thanksgiving myth comes from, which of course Tommy Orange will eviscerate very early on in this book. So he does a great job of setting the record straight on history and making us realize why it matters for his characters in the present day, because all of his characters have been affected by colonization in some shape, especially when we see the prevalence of addiction and broken families and crime that are affecting a lot of these characters. If you enjoyed the way that Tommy Orange writes about history in the prologues and in the interlude, I would definitely recommend checking out The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King, as this is a nonfiction book that serves a similar purpose, where Thomas King is basically trying to set the record straight on history, what myths do we believe that have no basis in reality, and how media stereotypes have also served to create this really weird representation of reality. Basically, when Tommy Orange includes history in his novels, it's not some kind of fun facts or trivia, but rather he wants the reader to realize that history is very relevant and is still shaping the lives of his characters in a very significant way well into the present day. So that makes for a pretty powerful statement in this book, and that's reflected in the title itself. There, while also a reference to a Radiohead song, is actually a reference to a Gertrude Stein quotation that she said upon returning to Oakland, and she said, "There is no there." And what she meant is the city had been so completely changed that she didn't recognize the place that she thought that she knew. And that's basically how an Indigenous person would feel about America, right? It has been so transformed, so heavily developed, that there is no there anymore. How does an Indigenous person go forward and build connections to the land when they're living in a concrete city? And it's a difficult question, but that's what I liked best about this book. There are no easy answers, and Tommy Orange isn't going to try to give you any answers, right? He provided us with a ton of characters in this book who are all going about things differently. They all have their own interpretation of how to be Indigenous living in America in the 21st century, and I really did love that about this book. So this is a book that is a little bit messy and complex, but at the same time, there is something that is so accessible about this book. These characters all have such incredible stories. So really, if you're just a reader who enjoys getting to know people and just getting to hear about their lives, then I think that you're really going to enjoy this book. I know that I certainly did. Lastly, I wanted to make a quick recommendation for any of you who enjoyed There There and are looking for a novel in a similar vein. I was heavily reminded of The Break by Katherina Vermette. This is also a debut novel that explores the Indigenous experience in an urban setting. So for this book, we see the lives of a Métis family living in Winnipeg, a Canadian city. And this book also employs multiple narrative perspectives that are centered around a violent event, and you sort of get the backstory of everyone involved and their own take on the situation. So in that way, it really reminded me a lot of There There, and it's also an incredible read as well. Thank you so much for hearing my thoughts on There There. I hope you consider picking it up if it sounds at all appealing to you. If you have read the book, please let me know what you've thought about it down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again some other time.